Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about conflict communication. Something that's very important to discuss because, well, we're always going to be in conflict with somebody. It's not likely that we're going to have the opportunity to go through life without ever having conflict. So how can we best get through it? And how do we handle it even when it comes up? And is it a bad thing to have conflict? So we'll talk about those things as we move through this. So one thing we have to think about is that, when it comes to conflict communication, it's one of those many things that's easy on paper, but actually hard in real life. Number one, because every single person's different. Every single person handles conflict differently. Every single person reacts differently to conflict. And everyone has different personalities. So it's one of those things that I can chart out this great way to solve a problem. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a absolute toss-up on how it works because I can only control my own messaging. I can only control what I want to say. And as I tell my students, and I've told you before, you can control the message, but you can't control the meaning. Because as soon as it appears in someone else's ears or in front of their eyes, all bets are off. It's up to how they do it. And that's something we recognize as common. I mean, how many times have you written something to somebody and they read it in the tone that their mind makes up? So very rarely are we very charitable when we read other people's works. Now, if we love somebody and we get something from them, we read it in a loving tone. If we're mad at somebody and we get something from them, we read it in an angry tone. Very rarely are we charitable and say, I'm going to read this with charity. I'm going to be open in my mind. I'm going to be kind and loving, and I'm going to read this with good sincerity. We typically don't do that. We jump in with our emotions and we read it whichever way we tend to read it. Happy, sad, angry, whatever the reason happens to be that our mind happens to be in. And it could also be the mood that we're in that day. So we hear a message from somebody, we read a message from somebody, and we're in a good mood that day. Chances are that's going to cruise through smoothly. If we get that message when we're in a bad mood, it doesn't matter how nice the message is, we're probably going to react in some kind of negative way. And that's something that we have to deal with and wrestle with. So that's one thing that's difficult to deal with. Other thing too about communication conflict, issues is that, it's across a variety of spectrums of people. It could be family, it could be friends, it could be coworkers, teammates, total strangers. And we handle that all differently as well too, because again, family members fairly well. You should be able to talk to them well. Friends, especially best friends, really well. You can talk to them a certain way. But as that distance starts to happen, we know less and less how to communicate with the other person, how to approach that thought. Because quite frankly, we don't know them. We don't know their communicative styles all that well. And we have that problem that comes into play. But really, when it comes to communication and dealing with conflict, we just have to realize that this is a situation where we have two or more people who are at odds because they're expressing, differing or incompatible ideas. And that's where the bulk of conflict comes from. So some kind of differing or incompatible ideas that just don't work well together. And that creates some kind of conflict. Now, again, when I say conflict, I'm going to make sure we're not talking about just straight up like fighting and yelling and screaming at each other, although that's clearly one avenue of conflict. We're just talking about any kind of time when you have those differing or incompatible ideas. So when it comes down to solving them, there are several things that we have to consider. We have to figure out how to focus on issues. We have to be able to focus on interests and then figure out how to move forward from there. And sometimes, of course, we'll also look at the idea of compromise and how that comes into play as well. But the heart of it, is something we've discussed in multiple episodes, and that's the idea of persuasion. How do I persuade the other person, to see things my way? Or how open am I to be persuaded by the other person to see things their way? And that's part of the wrestling, the verbal and mental wrestling that we have. Again, not yelling and screaming and calling each other names and that kind of fun stuff, but just instead of, I'm talking general all-around conflict that we have. Now, I'm going to cover a few myths about communication conflict first, because that's one of the things that I want to make sure we get out of the way first. And the first one is that conflict is harmful. Well, conflict isn't in of itself a harmful thing. I mean, we can escalate it and abuse each other with the conflict as our staging point to where we spring forward and abuse the other person. But conflict in and of itself isn't harmful. I mean, again, we have competing or different or incompatible ideas. Well, that gives us a chance to discuss things. And if you don't know your idea, obviously you're going to feel threatened, and that's typically when people tend to lash out. Or if you hold something super close to you and people are threatening you perceive they're threatening your ideas, we tend to lash out. So again, that's one of those things that we have this opportunity now to discuss things. And that helps me understand the ideas, that helps me understand you. And if I'm going into communication, conflict communication with a true open mind, here's a chance to get to know you better, to get to know your ideas better, and for you to know about me and my ideas better. And that's one of those things. It's actually a good thing. Another thing is that conflict should be avoided. Well, why should they be avoided? Why should we avoid any kind of conflict? Well, we don't like to have that pushback. We don't like to have our motives or our thoughts or ideas questioned. So we tend to say, like, I'll just avoid conflict altogether. But in reality, you can't avoid conflict. It's there. And the more that you avoid it, it's only going to get worse in a lot of instances. Very rarely when you avoid conflict does it go away, which is why whenever you have any kind of an impasse, it's important that you get past that impasse through communication and you end up figuring out some way to resolve it, and to come to some kind of conclusion, some type of reconciliation, some kind of language that has that. The more you stay divided, the more you stay apart, the more I think, well, if I could just separate time and distance, it'll go away. It's only getting worse. So we need to look at the idea of avoiding conflict being a bad thing. And then also, like when you avoid conflict, you avoid the possibility to improving your decision making. Because again, if you have your ideas and thoughts questioned, it forces you to reevaluate them and to understand why you have them. And that leads to you making better decisions about what you believe and how that helps you move forward. And the last thing is that all conflicts can be resolved. Not necessarily true. I mean, because when it comes down to it, there are certain things that you value that maybe you're not willing to go and change. So if you have some deep-seated belief, like for example, like religious beliefs, and you have those deeply seated in you, you believe in them wholeheartedly, you have full faith in those beliefs, what are the odds of someone pulling you away from those? Very little. So it's one of those things that kind of thing, you're not going to get me to leave my religious convictions. You're just not going to. So you have different religious convictions than I do. I'm not going to sway you. You're not going to sway me. So that's just the way it is. And sometimes you also have people who just refuse to come to any kind of reconciliation. Some people who just absolutely refuse to do it. And what are you going to do? You'll have people who they want to avoid the conflict, and they just cut off. We've been through an ugly era of cancel culture. There's still pockets of that around, but there are people out there who will cancel you, and they'll just try to just like, I'm going to clean that toxic relationship out of my life, kind of a thing. And in reality is, I'm running from resolution. I'm running from reconciliation. I don't want to solve this, and so they just cut that off and escape. In their minds, they're escaping, but it's hard for the other person who wants to resolve things to resolve with people who don't want to. So when there are people out there who refuse to resolve conflict with you, I mean, what can you do? You're kind of stuck. So those are things we need to be thinking about when it comes to myths, that it's always harmful, that it should be avoided, and that all conflicts can be resolved. Those are some basic myths. We would like to think that we can resolve things, but it's not always the case. So what causes conflict other than just the basic disagreement or having incompatible ideas? Well, we can have just differences in personality. I talked before about personality types in previous episode. You have your analyticals, your amiables, your expressives, your drivers. You have those types of people, and some of those people get along really well together, and some of them just don't. And as a result, that could cause conflict. And so how do we resolve that? How do we move forward? Another thing, of course, is perception. You'll hear sometimes people talking about, what they witness, what they think, their opinions, their beliefs, those kind of things. It's based on how they perceive things going on. And if you have an accurate perception and you disagree with that other thing, okay, that's one thing. but sometimes our perceptions can be skewed. You know, it's always dangerous to assume things. So I need to do what we call in communication perception checking. If there's something I see that's amiss, I need to clarify. Like, do you really think this way about this issue, or do you really believe these things? Just to clarify here, and that's perception checking. But we perceive things, and sometimes we run with that, and we create conflict with that instead of saying, "Is this what you meant?" And that's an issue that comes up. Another thing is information. Information has always been a big reason for conflict, especially between those who have it and those who don't. So if someone has information and you want it, you can see why this creates conflict. Or the sharing of information when you shouldn't. If anyone's ever trusted you with a secret and you leaked it, you know why they're mad at you. So that was all over information, which of course also led to trust and trust issues. But the information issues that have and have not kind of conflict that comes is a normal thing, and a lot of people are upset when they just don't get to know. And sometimes you don't need to know, and the conflict is within you, that you don't have the right to know, and you just have to come to grips with that. That's tough. Another thing is power. Power causes conflict a lot because people who seem and feel like they're powerless tend to be upset at those who have power. And those sometimes who have power abuse those people who are powerless. So you see that kind of dichotomy obviously being a major reason why conflict happens, because the people who are oppressed or perceive that they're oppressed, they want to, have things, equaled out at least, or ideally they could go to the point of having the power, and then they could then be the ones who end up abusing people. So power is a major issue when it comes to conflict. And then the last thing, of course, is influence. Influence is a major issue, too, that comes into play. Because what kind of influence do you have over another person? And what kind of influence do they have over you? And, certain people are in different levels of influence. Like for example, in my classroom, I'm the professor. I have the grade book. I have a tremendous amount of influence over my students. I'm also older, so by age, I have influence. I'm also more educated, so I have more influence over them in that way. So there's obviously an influence, dynamic in this relationship that could create conflict, and you'll see that all the time between bosses and their underlings, so supervisor and supervisees, you see that kind of thing all the time where you have a displacement, parents and children, you have that kind of influence, power play that comes in there, and you end up having some kind of conflict because some people, have the ability to exert influence on other people, and some people are kind of feel like they're more powerless against it. So that's part of it as well. Now, the consequences, of course, aren't obvious when it comes to personal lives or professional lives. I mean, people are kept, when there's conflict, people are kept from accomplishing tasks. If there's some kind of conflict going on, it's hard to get the next thing done if you have this wall that you keep banging against, or you have to spend the time to go around it or over the wall or even under the wall, whatever it takes. You have all those issues that come into play, and, well, that's a loss of productivity. It's a loss of your sense of accomplishment, and sometimes it actually stops the work cold, and you're not able to go forward until you resolve whatever that conflict is and then move forward. It also interferes not just with the work being done, but also with the quality of work and the decision making that's done. So if you have some kind of conflict that comes along, you're trying to get some good work done, but then there's something that's blocking you that you have to go around. Sometimes corners get cut and other things happen and poor decisions are made to just get past that issue. Or if someone has good information, we talk about information issues, if someone who has good information is needed for us to move forward that project, and we have a conflict and they're not giving it to us, so there's a conflict there. Obviously, if we need that piece of information, you can guess that the project moving forward is lacking information. That's going to be a problem, and that's not going to work well. So that's another issue to think about. And then also, it just can threaten the existence of the organization. This could be a business. This could be a family. This could be a friend group. Whenever you have any kind of conflict, if it's not resolved, and it's not worked through, it's not discussed, you could end up having that situation where the existence of that group is shattered. And you'll see that sometimes. You'll see friend groups or families or businesses or nonprofits or whatever just implode or explode depending on how the situation goes, because they don't know how to handle the situation or how to resolve it, or the violation, the method of the conflict was so great that dissolution of the group is the best possible option. Now, there are a couple kinds of conflict to talk about. The first one is pseudo-conflict, and that's basically people misunderstanding each other. And they may actually agree with each other. It's just that poor communication creates the conflict, which is why it's pseudo-conflict. For example, if I ask you, what's the quickest or what's the best way to get to Walmart in your town? And you could say, oh, well, you just go out Main Street and you hang a left. Or you could say, oh, actually, I like to drive out Center Street and hang a right. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You're they start fighting over the direction, and both directions actually get you to Walmart. It's just a question of, well, you're arguing which one's better, but you both end up at Walmart, and you're arguing over that. So you agree in that there's like, here's how we get to Walmart, but there's, you tend to think, no, I'm going to stake my ground on the my one way. So it's a pseudo conflict. It's not really a real conflict. It's a pseudo conflict in that manner, because we tend to just misunderstand each other. And sometimes it also happens like if I misspeak or you misinterpret a word I say, and we have an argument, and at the end of the argument we're like, wait a minute, we actually agree. It's like, I know, so why are we fighting? It's like, oh, I thought you said this. It's like, no, I said this. Like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. And you've had those, and we've had those. That's why it's a pseudo conflict. And then from there's also a simple conflict, and that's where, I don't mean simple as in like it's easy. I mean easy as in how it happens, and that's like we disagree about issues. So that's why it's a simple conflict, and it's not complex in how it's happened. We just disagree. We know what each other wants, but neither of us can achieve our goal without preventing the other from getting theirs. So you can see why that would be a problem, because I want to do X, you want to do Y. We both stand in each other's way, and one of us has to win. If I want what I want, and you want what you want, we have to go until one of us wins. And that's the mindset that happens whenever we have simple conflict. Think of it like two children fighting over a toy. Each one wants it. It's pretty simple to understand that dynamic, hence the term simple conflict. And then the last one to talk about is the concept of ego conflict, and that's basically a clash of personalities. So when you think about someone's ego getting in the way of their pride, that's a major issue. And you see that people become defensive about the positions because of a perceived or a real personal attack. So the conflict that happens because, maybe it starts off simple, like I want something, you want something. The next day it escalates to insults and name calling and all that kind of other stuff like that. Then who cares about the thing that we're fighting over? Now we're at each other's throats because of how mean we are to each other. And neither one of us wants to back away from our own pride issues to say, I shouldn't have said that, I'm sorry. And accountability comes into this too. Ego, like when you hear about people refusing, to reconcile, a lot of it's an ego problem. They just refuse to admit that maybe I have some fault here. Maybe I need to apologize. So if you're in a situation where one person's always apologizing and you're not, chances are either they've actually really, really wronged you and totally, or maybe they're trying to reconcile and you're not. You're the one that's not apologizing for a reason, because your pride, your lack of accountability is kicking in and you're just not doing it. That's a major problem with ego conflict. So those are the basic kinds of things that we want to understand when it comes to this introduction to crisis communication and conflict resolution. In a next episode, we're going to talk about the ideas of how we can move through these things a little bit more and dig into things a little bit greater to understand the particulars of things. But I wanted to just at least start off with an introduction, an overview of crisis communication and conflict resolution, how we kind of got here in the first place, and just basically what's it going to take to move through it. So again, if we're constantly focusing on winning, if we're constantly focusing on being right, we're going to have lots of conflict issues. Also, if we want to flee from every type of piece of conflict that comes our way, everything that comes our way, we're also going to have conflict issues. It's when we are willing to recognize that conflict is natural, conflict is normal, because people are different. People also make mistakes. People have different beliefs. People have different viewpoints. People have different perceptions. Once we realize that's normal, then we start realizing that conflict is actually normal. And once we accept that conflict is normal, then we can start chiseling away and resolving conflict issues. So that's what I have for you right now. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. I greatly appreciate that, especially the way YouTube and their algorithms work. If you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in this long anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.